Hi, I'm Dan Kubisky, co-chair of the International Community of the Society of Professional Journalists. The Voice of America was back in the news this week when President-elect Donald Trump named former journalist and twice defeated political candidate Kari Lake of Arizona as the new head of Voice of America. Trump has not released his choice for the CEO position of the VOA parent organization, the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Previous attacks on VOA during the first Trump administration and by his supporters this year have raised concerns that the editorial independence of VOA and other news agencies under the USAGM umbrella could be in jeopardy. With me now is Jim Fry, who just recently retired from VOA. Prior to joining VOA, Jim worked in radio, television, and newspapers in Texas, Nebraska, Missouri, and Washington. He eventually landed at VOA, where he served as the assistant managing editor of the VOA English language newsroom, and he directed coverage of U.S. and national politics. Jim later moved on to the other side of the journalism firewall at VOA, where he led VOA's outreach and engagements as deputy director of public relations. Jim, thank you very much for taking time from your retirement to talk about a little bit about the history, but also what we might expect to see.
So let me first point out that you have your Press Freedom T-shirt on, and I was going to wear my Missouri journalism T-shirt, which I can't seem to get a focus on. But this was a T-shirt that was put out by the Press Freedom section of the University of Missouri, which is where I attended school back shortly after the last pterodactyl was roaming the plains. So I'm wearing my sweatshirt because up here in New England, where I now live, you don't wear T-shirts in December very often.
Well, I know the folks in Missouri will be very proud of you representing today.
Well, I'm very proud of the University of Missouri and the journalism school, particularly the journalism school, which remains the best in the nation.
I'll be sure to add their hashtag when I post this on YouTube later. Okay, let's get into it. The Trump administration is not the first administration that has criticized Voice of America or their coverage, and nor was it the first who attempted to try to influence how reporters do their jobs. Could you just give us a little rundown of maybe what may have happened in the past and what has taken place in order to help protect journalists from influences from the party in power?
Well, I'm not prepared to talk about every time the VOA firewall has come under fire, so to speak. I mean, there have been any number of instances in the past where administrations might have wanted VOA to say one thing or another. I'm much more familiar with what happened 4 years ago, and in that period, in the last year of the Trump administration. I would say that there was legislation in 1994 that set up that made the firewall, as we call it, much more clear in terms of what it means for VOA journalists. It is basically similar to the firewalls you hear about on commercial media. It is supposed to separate the journalists from sort of a governing portion of an organization. In the case of, say, a corporate journalism outlet, it is supposed to separate you from sales and that sort of thing. At Voice of America, the firewall is meant to separate the journalism, the actual journalism coverage, from the politics and the governance of any particular administration. So that has been in effect for quite a long time, and it's to make the case that it isn't or hasn't been used in any number of administrations to protect the journalism is not correct.
Okay, all right. Well, the Heritage Foundation paper, Project 2025, in their section about Voice of America, claims that the firewall protecting journalists from the influence by the party in power is not absolute. They claim the VOA director and the CEO of the USAGM have the authority to direct news coverage, and therefore they're allowed to force reporters to adjust their reporting to ensure positive coverage of the administration. So what's your take on that?
Well, that's actually not correct. It shouldn't be correct. Now, there have been instances where there have been attempts by some administrations to at least direct some of the coverage. But in the case, so let me say, in my own experience at Voice of America, there have been any number of times that the lawyers who are involved in the agency have made sure the journalists know that an administration cannot tell them what to cover, how to cover, what to say. And there have been some very specific things that happened. Some of them, really, we were told were lawyer client in the lawyer client area. But there have been very specific times when, say, a State Department employee has talked to an editor and wanted coverage in a certain way. And that State Department employee later was told by their own bosses, no, you can't do that. So, it's something that most of the administrations have taken, the administrations of USAGM have taken very seriously, and the reporters and the journalists and the editors take seriously as well. The real question about the firewall is, where is it at any one time? So, you bring up VOA director, you bring up USAGM CEO. If the firewall has gone from the CEO to the director and then beyond to, the protection of the firewall, that's really the danger area. The CEO of USAGM should not be telling reporters and editors what to do. And in fact, in the whistleblower case that was decided during the last administration, it was made very clear that the CEO in the last Trump administration should not be involved in that.
Well, in fact, during that administration, the CEO, Michael Pack, he had not only this whistleblower case, but there was an inspector general report, and there was also a special counsel report describing actions that he took that in some cases appeared to be completely illegal and others were violation of norms. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, let me say, in the whistleblower case, which was at least decided initially during the time Michael Pack was in office, he was enjoined by a judge from telling reporters what to do, from that kind of behavior. At least that's my recollection of that. The Office of Special Counsel released a report in May of 2023. I believe they actually received the report sometime in February. That was done by 3 outside experts. And what that report found was, in some instances, whistleblower complaints probably were not decided. They didn't decide that everything the whistleblowers were complaining about, for example, was an abuse of power or gross mismanagement. But the Office of Special Counsel report found there were a number of instances where the CEO under Trump abused the power, his power in government, grossly mismanaged the agency, and there were even some instances where there was a question of whether or not he violated the law. So under abuse of power, some of that had to do with some of the initial actions that the CEO took, which was suspending the security clearances of several executives whom he later removed from the agency. So that was considered an abuse of power. And later, at the end, he, according to this report, illegally shared employee-related materials on his last day of office with somebody outside the agency. The gross mismanagement involves some of the journalism. So at the time, and even now, Voice of America has a standards editor who is the person um, who keeps an eye on the programming, keeps an eye on the coverage, and can help lead journalists in the proper direction. They also the standards editors usually also have training for journalists. I mean, you have to realize that we have a building full of journalists, many who are from around the world, who don't immediately understand or know when they come to the United States what the standards are for coverage. So the standards editor does that. And what happened in 2020 was the standards editor was removed from his position and put in a position with no function for, I believe it was about 4 months. And so that was considered to be gross mismanagement because there were a couple of instances where programming and reporting was adjudged to be not correct. And the question is whether, if there was a standards editor in at the time, would that have helped? It was one of them was in the Urdu service, for example. The other thing that the Office of Special Counsel report, another action that was considered gross mismanagement was, as they put it, taking actions that are inconsistent with statutory mandates regarding journalist independence and integrity. So for those who say that there is no firewall or the firewall is inaccurate or there shouldn't be a firewall, here is an Office of Special Counsel, which is an independent federal agency, saying it was gross mismanagement to take actions that were inconsistent with that firewall. So, and that report was very voluminous. There were lots of things that came up in that, but those are the most important things as we move forward toward another administration.
Okay, that was a really good explanation about the firewall situation, but Project 2025 talks about other things as well, especially what to do with VOA. Are there any other points in their document that raise red flags for you?
Okay, so for anyone who is not exactly clear on what Project 2025 is, that's the Heritage Foundation document that was set up to be by Heritage and by many people who served in the last Trump administration and are now being called on to serve again on how another Trump administration will govern. And when it comes to US AGM and government media, and particularly Voice of America, there are some suggestions that are quite troubling. So, for example, it says, if VOA is not put in the direct chain of command under the National Security Council, serious consideration should be given to putting VOA under direct supervision of the Office of Global Public Affairs in the Department of State. In both those instances, the suggestion is either the White House has accountability control over Voice of America and then also the journalism, or the State Department. In both instances, we're talking about the political end or the policy end of an administration that could, the idea is for an administration to control through the CEO and the accountability process what journalists can and can't say. If the other thing that it suggests is that there should be clear lines of communication between the US AGM and an appropriate office of this National Security Council. They say that's sorely lacking, and there hasn't been a reasonable accountability in the past. Just to be clear, really what this means, as part of the whistleblower lawsuit, one of the U.S. Assistant Attorney General who responded for the government responded this way, and this is a quote: "Voice of America is a government agency. Its speech, even in a journalistic capacity, is government speech. In sum, it is consistent with the Constitution for the CEO to control the content of the network's broadcasts." I don't think anything could be more clear. That the last administration actually wanted the CEO controlling the content of the broadcast. The CEO is a presidentially appointed position. And so it wouldn't be any more clear that they're talking about an administration controlling the content. And why is that important? Well, go
Jim,
ahead.
yeah, I just, you know, the point is that that this lawyer made, this is a government agency,
Right.
and government agencies have to bend to whoever's in power in the White House.
Not
So,
not all government agencies.
how is VOA different?
Well, any number of government agencies are called independent, and USAGM is considered an independent agency, and that word independent means they are independent from political influence. So if you look at the U.S. the Attorney General, for example, that has in practice been an independent agency in terms of law enforcement and that sort of thing. So some would question whether it's always been the case. There have been instances in the past, in the Nixon administration and 4 years ago, and some people who would claim that the Biden administration has somehow gotten involved. I haven't seen any evidence of that, but the explanation here is that there are any number of U.S. government agencies that are independent for a reason. They're independent because you don't want politics. You don't want politics really influencing what they do. So, for example, if you have agencies that are investigative, that investigate what's going on within a federal government, such as an Office of Inspector General, do you really want politics involved in that when that Office of Inspector General is looking to see whether an agency or part of an agency has acted incorrectly? Well, you really don't, if you want to get to the truth. The reason VOA is considered to be an independent agency is because what VOA does is broadcast and also now on the internet put out news to international audiences. And the whole idea in the past and even now is that you don't put out propaganda, that you actually cover the news as reporters under journalistic strictures. And the reason you do that is because many of the audiences that we're reaching, they know what propaganda is because they're getting it from their government all the time. If it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's got to be a duck. They know that. And so if we're putting out propaganda, it's not going to be much of a representation of democracy because they're not going to, these audiences are going to say, why should I listen to U.S. government broadcasting? Why should I believe anything that comes from it? Because they're just doing what our government does. So that's really the reason for the independence. That's the reason for the firewall. And that's the reason why no CEO who's appointed by a U.S. president should be telling the journalists what to report.
Okay, excellent. You touched on this a little bit, but I'd like to get your view on why should average Americans who don't depend on VOA for reporting, in fact, VOA is forbidden from reporting or targeting audiences in the United States. So why should these Americans be concerned about VOA and how it's run? And also, why should other journalists be concerned?
Well, so first of all, for the American taxpayer spends an awful lot of money on national security, protecting the United States and protecting our citizens around the world. And a lot of that money is spent on weapons systems, on keeping a navy in the water, on keeping a nuclear component, on that sort of thing. The Voice of America costs under $1 billion, I think it is, well under that. And the theory is, and we believe it to be the case, that the spending for Voice of America, when I say under $1 billion, that's all of USAGM. If I'm not, I believe I'm accurate on those figures. But the idea is that you're reaching audiences with what folks would call soft power. You don't have to spend several $billions more in national security if audiences around the world see what we're all about and they are, they're impressed with it and supportive of the democracy. So that's why Americans should be supportive of, a U.S. agency for global media that is not U.S. government propaganda.
And then just lastly, it's not like January 21st, Carrie Lake is going to take over VOA. There's a process for her to be named to that position.
Okay, so
Could you
talking
just
about
lay out kind of the steps on that?
right. So you're mentioning Carrie Lake. Carrie Lake is the lost a Senate race and lost a governor's race in Arizona. She is she has been sort of a Republican superstar in the last couple of elections, but didn't quite get over the hump. There are those who would say that, particularly in the governor's race 2 years ago, she was a little bit truth challenged because she has never conceded that she lost the race. And as recently as June, she lost a court case and had faced a defamation lawsuit from a Republican elected official in that state. So you have this appointment, and then back up several days ago, and on, I believe it's called Truth Social, the Trump former President Trump and President-elect Trump said he would nominate Carrie Lake to be the director of Voice of America. Well, there's a real question as to whether she will ever step inside the building the way things are set up now. So after the last administration, there were some changes to structure of USAGM. And so you have a CEO who is to be appointed by a president. So there's a CEO in now, Amanda Bennett. One would guess at some point she will either be asked to leave or will resign, and there will be a Trump CEO who will be appointed and or nominated, and would need to go through the Senate through advice and consent. The VOA director is a job that cannot be that can be appointed by the USAGM CEO, but not alone. There is a bipartisan International Broadcasting Advisory Board whose structure was clarified in the last 3 years through legislation. It is a 7-member board. 6 members are nominated by president and approved by the Senate through advice and consent. There should be 3. There's supposed to be 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats on that board, and there is a board now that is in place. The 7th member is always the U.S. Secretary of State, and only when that board acts to approve, to give majority approval to a USAGM CEO can a VOA director be put in place. So it is not like it has been in the past, where an administration can put in the immediate past, where an administration could put in a Voice of America director. That director is supposed to go through that process. So, the question is whether the guardrails, and these are considered to be guardrails, whether these guardrails will stand after January 20th.
Okay. Thank you. That actually clarified it for me a lot, what the process is. Jim, I want to thank you very much for taking time. I know you've been traveling a bit and you're enjoying your retirement, and I hate to just draw you out again and to do this, but talking with you is always a pleasure. So thank you very much for spending time with us and walking us through what has happened in the past and what might be coming up as well.
Okay, you're welcome. It was a pleasure of being here.